Alexander Pope for other uses. See Alexander Pope disambiguation. Alexander Pope poet signature. Alexander Pope, the 21st of May 1688, the 30th of May 1744, was an 18th century English poet. He is best known for his satirical verse, including Essay on Criticism, The Rape of the Lock and the Dunciad, and for his translation of Homer. He is the second most frequently quoted writer in the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations after Shakespeare. 1. Contents. Early life. Edit. Alexander Pope was born to Alexander Pope Sr., 1646–1717. A linen merchant of Plough Court, Lombard Street, London, and his wife Edith née Turner, 1643–1733, who were both Catholics. 3. Edith's sister Christiana was the wife of the famous miniature painter Samuel Cooper. Pope's education was affected by the recently enacted Test Acts, which upheld the status of the Established Church of England and banned Catholics from teaching, attending a university, voting, or holding public office on pain of perpetual imprisonment. Pope was taught to read by his aunt, and went to Twyford School in about 1698–99. 3. He then went to 2 Catholic schools in London. 3. Such schools, while illegal, were tolerated in some areas. 4. A likeness of Pope derived from a portrait by William Hoare, 5, in 1700. His family moved to a small estate at Popeswood in Binfield, Berkshire, close to the Royal Windsor Forest. 3. This was due to strong anti-Catholic sentiment and a statute preventing Catholics from living within 10 miles, 16 kilometers, of either London or Westminster. 6. Pope would later describe the countryside around the house in his poem Windsor Forest. 7. Pope's formal education ended at this time, and from then on he mostly educated himself by reading the works of classical writers such as the satirist Horace and Juvenal, the epic poet Homer and Virgil, as well as English authors such as Geoffrey Chaucer, William Shakespeare and John Dryden. 3. He also studied many languages and read works by English, French, Italian, Latin, and Greek poets. After 5 years of study, Pope came into contact with figures from the London Literary Society such as William Wycherley, William Congreve, Samuel Garth, William Trumbull, and William Walsh. 3. 4. At Binfield, he also began to make many important friends. One of them, John Caryll, the future dedicatee of The Rape of the Lock, was 20 years older than the poet and had made many acquaintances in the London literary world. He introduced the young Pope to the aging playwright William Wycherley and to William Walsh, a minor poet, who helped Pope revise his first major work, the Pastorals. He also met the Blount sisters, Teresa and Martha, both of whom would remain lifelong friends. 4. From the age of 12, he suffered numerous health problems including Pott's disease, a form of tuberculosis that affects the spine, which deformed his body and stunted his growth, leaving him with a severe hunchback. His tuberculosis infection caused other health problems including respiratory difficulties, high fevers, inflamed eyes, and abdominal pain. 3. He grew to a height of only 1.37 meters, 4 feet 6 in. Pope was already removed from society because he was Catholic. His poor health only alienated him further. Although he never married, he had many female friends to whom he wrote witty letters. including Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. Allegedly, his lifelong friend Martha Blount was his lover. 4, 8, 9, 10, plaque above Pope's Grotto at Twickenham in May 1709. Pope's Pastorals was published in the sixth part of Tonson's Poetical Miscellanies. This earned Pope instant fame, and was followed by an essay on criticism, published in May 1711, which was equally well received. Pope's Villa at Twickenham, showing the grotto, from a watercolor produced soon after his death. Around 1711, Pope made friends with Tory writers John Gay, Jonathan Swift, Thomas Parnell and John Arbuthnot, who together formed the satirical Scriblerus Club. The aim of the club was to satirize ignorance and pedantry in the form of the fictional scholar Martinus Scriblerus. He also made friends with Whig writers Joseph Addison and Richard Steele. In March 1713, Windsor Forest 7 was published to great acclaim. 4. During Pope's friendship with Joseph Addison, he contributed to Addison's play Cato, as well as writing for The Guardian and The Spectator. Around this time he began the work of translating the Iliad, which was a painstaking process. Publication began in 1715 and did not end until 1720. 4. In 1714, the political situation worsened with the death of Queen Anne and the disputed succession between the Hanoverians and the Jacobites, leading to the Jacobite Rising of 1715. Though Pope as a Catholic might have been expected to have supported the Jacobites because of his religious and political affiliations. According to Maynard Mack, where Pope himself stood on these matters can probably never be confidently known. These events led to an immediate downturn in the fortunes of the Tories. And Pope's friend, Henry St. John, 1st Viscount Bolingbroke, fled to France. Pope lived in his parents' house in Mawson Row, Chiswick, between 1716 and 1719. The red brick building is now the Mawson Arms, commemorating him with a blue plaque. 11. The money made from his translation of Homer allowed Pope to move in 1719 to a villa at Twickenham, where he created his now famous grotto and gardens. The serendipitous discovery of a spring during the subterranean retreat's excavations enabled it to be filled with the relaxing sound of trickling water, which would quietly echo around the chambers. Pope was said to have remarked that were it to have nymphs as well, it would be complete in everything. Although the house and gardens have long since been demolished, much of this grotto still survives. The grotto now lies beneath Radnor House Independent Co-ed School, and is occasionally open to the public. 812 Mawson Arms, Chiswick Lane. With Pope Blue Plaque Essay on Criticism Edit Main Article, An Essay on Criticism. An Essay on Criticism was first published anonymously on 15 May 1711. Pope began writing the poem early in his career and took about 3 years to finish it. At the time the poem was published, the heroic couplet style in which it was written was a moderately new poetic form, and Pope's work was an ambitious attempt to identify and refine his own positions as a poet and critic. The poem was said to be a response to an ongoing debate on the question of whether poetry should be natural, or written according to predetermined artificial rules inherited from the classical past. 13. The essay begins with a discussion of the standard rules that govern poetry by which a critic passes judgment. Pope comments on the classical authors who dealt with such standards, and the authority that he believed should be accredited to them. He discusses the laws to which a critic should adhere while critiquing poetry, and points out that critics serve an important function in aiding poets with the works, as opposed to the practice of attacking them. 14. The final section of an essay on criticism discusses the moral qualities and virtues inherent in the ideal critic, who, Pope claims, is also the ideal man. Rape of the Lock. Edit. Pope's most famous poem is The Rape of the Lock, first published in 1712, with a revised version published in 1714. A mock epic. It satirizes a high society quarrel between Arabella Fermor, the Belinda of the poem, and Lord Petre, who had snipped a lock of hair from her head without her permission. The satirical style is tempered, however, by a genuine and almost voyeuristic interest in the beau monde, fashionable world, of 18th-century English society. 15. The revised and extended version of the poem brought more clearly into focus its true subject, the onset of acquisitive individualism and a society of conspicuous consumers. In the world of the poem, purchased artifacts displace human agency, and trivial things assume dominance. 16. Dunciad and Moral Essays. Edit. Alexander Pope. Painting attributed to English painter Jonathan Richardson, c. 1736. Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Though the Dunciad was first published anonymously in Dublin, its authorship was not in doubt. Pope pilloried a host of other hacks, scribblers, and dunces, in addition to Theobald, and Maynard Mac has accordingly called its publication in many ways the greatest act of folly in Pope's life, though a masterpiece which would become one of the most challenging and distinctive works in the history of English poetry. Writes Mac. It bore bitter fruit. It brought the poet in his own time the hostility of its victims and the sympathizers, who pursued him implacably from then on with a few damaging truths and a host of slanders and lies. 17. According to his half-sister Magdalen Rackett, some of Pope's targets were so enraged by the Dunciad that they threatened him. "My brother does not seem to know what fear is," she told Joseph Spence, explaining that Pope loved to walk alone, so went accompanied by his Great Dane, Bounce, and for some time carried pistols in his pocket. 18. Together with John Gay's The Beggar's Opera and Swift's Gulliver's Travels, this first Dunciad was part of a concerted propaganda assault against Walpole's Whig ministry and the financial revolution it stabilized. Although he was a keen participant in the stock and money markets, Pope never missed an opportunity to satirize the personal, social and political effects of the new scheme of things. From The Rape of the Lock onwards, these satirical themes are a constant in his work. In 1731, Pope published his Epistle to Burlington, on the subject of architecture, the first of 4 poems which would later be grouped under the title Moral Essays, 1731–35. In the epistle, Pope ridiculed the bad taste of the aristocrat Timon. Pope's enemies claimed he was attacking the Duke of Chandos and his estate. Canons. Though the charge was untrue, it did Pope a great deal of damage. An Essay on Man. Edit. Main article. An Essay on Man. An essay on man is a philosophical poem, written in heroic couplets and published between 1732 and 1734. Pope intended this poem to be the centerpiece of a proposed system of ethics that was to be put forth in poetic form. It was a piece of work that Pope intended to make into a larger work. However, he did not live to complete it. 19. The poem is an attempt to vindicate the ways of God to man. A variation on Milton's attempt in Paradise Lost to justify the ways of God to man. 1.26. It challenges as prideful an anthropocentric worldview. The poem is not solely Christian. However, it makes an assumption that man has fallen and must seek his own salvation. 19. Alexander Pope circa 1742. It consists of 4 epistles that are addressed to Lord Bolingbroke. Pope presents an idea on his view of the universe. He says that no matter how imperfect, complex, inscrutable and disturbing the universe appears to be, it functions in a rational fashion according to the natural laws. The natural laws consider the universe as a whole a perfect work of God. To humans it appears to be evil and imperfect in many ways. However, Pope points out that this is due to our limited mindset and limited intellectual capacity. Pope gets the message across that humans must accept the position in the great chain of being, which is at a middle stage between the angels and the beasts of the world. If we are able to accomplish this, then we potentially could lead happy and virtuous lives. 19. The poem is an affirmative poem of faith. Life seems to be chaotic and confusing to man when he is in the center of it. But according to Pope, it is really divinely ordered. In Pope's world, God exists and is what he centers the universe around in order to have an ordered structure. The limited intelligence of man can only take in tiny portions of this order and can experience only partial truths. Hence man must rely on hope, which then leads into faith. Man must be aware of his existence in the universe and what he brings to it. In terms of riches, power, and fame, it is man's duty to strive to be good regardless of other situations. This is the message Pope is trying to get across to the reader. 20. Later life and works. Edit. The death of Alexander Pope from Musaeus. A threnody by William Mason. Diana holds the dying Pope, and John Milton, Edmund Spenser, and Geoffrey Chaucer prepare to welcome him to heaven. The Imitations of Horace followed, 1733–38. These were written in the popular Augustan form of the imitation of a classical poet. Not so much a translation of his works as an updating with contemporary references. Pope used the model of Horace to satirize life under George II. Especially what he regarded as the widespread corruption tainting the country under Walpole's influence and the poor quality of the court's artistic taste. Pope also added a wholly original poem, an epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, as an introduction to the Imitations. It reviews his own literary career and includes the famous portraits of Lord Hervey, Sporus, and Addison Atticus. In 1738 he wrote the Universal Prayer. 21. After 1738, Pope wrote little. He toyed with the idea of composing a patriotic epic in blank verse called Brutus. But only the opening lines survive. His major work in these years was revising and expanding his masterpiece the Dunciad. Book 4 appeared in 1742, and a complete revision of the whole poem in the following year. In this version, Pope replaced the hero, Louis Theobald, with the poet laureate Colley Cibber as king of dunces. But the real focus of the revised poem is Walpole and all his works. By now Pope's health, which had never been good, was failing. When told by his physician, on the morning of his death, that he was better, Pope replied, "Here am I, dying of 100 good symptoms." 2223. He died in his villa surrounded by friends on the 30th of May 1744. About 11 o'clock at night. On the previous day, the 29th of May 1744, Pope had called for a priest and received the last rites of the Roman Catholic Church. He was buried in the nave of St. Mary's Church, Twickenham. Translations and editions. Edit. Translation of the Iliad. Edit. Pope had been fascinated by Homer since childhood. In 1713, he announced his plans to publish a translation of the Iliad. The work would be available by subscription, with one volume appearing every year over the course of 6 years. Pope secured a revolutionary deal with the publisher Bernard Lintott, which earned him 200 guineas £210 a volume, equivalent to about £28,700 in 2019. 24, a vast sum at the time. His translation of the Iliad appeared between 1715 and 1720. It was acclaimed by Samuel Johnson as a performance which no age or nation could hope to equal, although the classical scholar Richard Bentley wrote, "It is a pretty poem, Mr. Pope. But you must not call it Homer." Citation needed. Translation of the Odyssey. Edit. Frontispiece and title page of a 1752 edition of Pope's Odyssey encouraged by the success of the Iliad. Pope published a translation of the Odyssey in 1726 with the help of William Broome and Elijah Fenton. Broome translated 8 books, 2, 6, 8, 11, 12, 16, 18. 23. Fenton 4, 1, 4, 19. 20, and Pope the remaining 12. Broome provided the annotations. 25. Pope attempted to conceal the extent of the collaboration. 26, but the secret leaked out. It did some damage to Pope's reputation for a time, but not to his profits. 27. Leslie Stephen considered Pope's portion of the Odyssey inferior to his version of the Iliad, as Pope had put more effort into the earlier work, to which in any case his style was better suited. 28. Edition of Shakespeare's works. Edit. Learn how and when to remove this template message in this period. Pope was also employed by the publisher Jacob Tonson to produce an opulent new edition of Shakespeare. When it finally appeared, in 1725, this edition silently regularized Shakespeare's meter and rewrote his verse in a number of places. Pope also demoted about 1560 lines of Shakespearean material to footnotes, arguing that they were so excessively bad that Shakespeare could never have written them. Other lines were excluded from the edition altogether. In 1726, the lawyer, poet and pantomime deviser Louis Theobald published a scathing pamphlet called Shakespeare Restored, which catalogued the errors in Pope's work and suggested a number of revisions to the text. The second edition of Pope's Shakespeare appeared in 1728, but aside from making some minor revisions to the preface, it seems that Pope had little to do with it. Most later 18th-century editors of Shakespeare dismissed Pope's creatively motivated approach to textual criticism. Pope's preface, however, continued to be highly rated. It was suggested that Shakespeare's texts were thoroughly contaminated by actors' interpolations and they would influence editors for most of the 18th century. Reception. Edit. By the mid-18th century new fashions in poetry emerge. A decade after Pope's death, Joseph Warton claimed that Pope's style of poetry was not the most excellent form of the art. The Romantic movement that rose to prominence in early 19th century England was more ambivalent towards his work. Though Lord Byron identified Pope as one of his chief influences, believing his scathing satire of contemporary English literature, English bards and Scotch reviewers to be a continuance of Pope's tradition. William Wordsworth found Pope's style fundamentally too decadent a representation of the human condition. 4. George Gilfillan in his study of 1856 described Pope's talent as a rose peering into the summer air. Fine, rather than powerful. 29. In the 20th century Pope's reputation was revived. Pope's work was, of course, full of references to the people and places of his time, and these aided people's understanding of the past. The post-war period stressed the power of Pope's poetry, recognizing that Pope's immersion in Christian and biblical culture lent depth to his poetry. For example, Maynard Mac, the great Pope scholar of the mid to late 20th century, argued that Pope's moral vision demanded as much respect as his technical excellence. In the years 1953–1967 the definitive Twickenham edition of Pope's poems was published in 10 volumes, including an index volume. 4. If you like this video, please subscribe and share.